All right, Saagar, what are you looking at?
Well, there's been so much going on in the world it literally feels dizzying, of course taking attention off many, many topics. But if we proceed under the hope that I maintain there will be no nuclear Armageddon, then it is still important to pay attention to the other big stories that mattered in the before times. The biggest before Ukraine was COVID, the COVID pandemic. The embrace in this country of a new regime of censorship of social control, unprecedented elite consensus about what everyone should do with their own bodies. I've always said it's impossible to decouple policy that followed from the pandemic from the debate about where COVID came from in the first place. The authoritarianism and corruption that stopped legitimate inquiry into whether COVID leaked from the lab was a microcosm of exactly what went wrong with the debate in the first place. Developments this week prove exactly why, more than 2 years later, the inability of the media or elite to ever have an honest conversation with America leaves us more vulnerable today than ever before. And that latest development in the lab leak story is unbelievable, unbelievable. Dr. Fauci, in the waning months of his tenure as head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, is giving out a grant for research on bat coronaviruses. If that grant of research wasn't bad enough, the person who is awarded the grant is none other than Peter Daszak, who is the head of Eco Health Alliance. If you are not familiar, let's take a trip back down memory lane. Peter Daszak and the Eco Health Alliance are the organization which received a grant from Dr. Fauci and the NIAID before the COVID-19 pandemic. It served as a cutout for funding of something called gain of function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That type of research effectively involves brewing up new types of viruses in the lab for the purpose of trying to predict future pandemics that might arise naturally and then creating vaccines or antidotes to those viruses. The research was actually barred by the Obama administration for being too risky in 2014. It was, though, violated and eventually reversed by Dr. Fauci under Donald Trump. The key to that story is that Fauci's funding of gain-of-function research at the lab and the role of Dr. Peter Daszak was a major point of vulnerability in the opening days of the pandemic when emails revealed that the initial reaction by those who looked at the emerging coronavirus in January of 2020 was COVID-19 almost certainly came from a lab. As I have shown here before with government documents since released, in the span of just 2 weeks, a full-blown cover-up ensued. Dr. Fauci, working with others who relied on him for grant money, actively got a false article published which declared that COVID did not leak from the Wuhan lab, setting the scientific consensus. That paper served as a justification for a now infamous letter published by The Lancet in February 2020, which, quote, strongly condemned any rumors or conspiracy theorists, so-called, who believed that COVID came from the lab. From there, the position became doctrine, and it was impossible to question. Twitter accounts were suspended for suggesting it, YouTube accounts were disabled, full-scale censorship at the highest level of our government. And then the facts began to come out. The first crack in the establishment's armor was Daszak himself, who might be one of the most corrupt figures in this story, other than Fauci. Daszak was appointed as a member of the World Health Organization's task force responsible for investigating whether COVID leaked from the lab in the first place. Miraculously, guess what they found? It didn't. The justification, well, he had no access to the data, but he took the Chinese word for it. Seriously, that's what he said when he was pressed. Let's take a listen.
We met with them, we said, do you audit the lab? And they said, annually. Did you audit it after the outbreak? Yes. Was anything found? No. Do you test your staff? Yes. No.
But you're just taking their word for it.
Well, what else can we do?
From there, things really began to spiral. The former CDC director, Robert Redfield, told Dr. Sanjay Gupta on CNN he believed from the beginning COVID leaked from the Wuhan lab, that he had seen evidence to back that up, and that he was retaliated against by the bureaucracy from believing it. From there, reams of evidence began to pour out that I've covered here before. Research showing sickness coming out of the lab in November 2019, athletes getting sick in China, search data for symptoms of COVID, the fact that the structure of the virus itself has always looked to be lab-made. At this point, even the scientific community and the medical journal The Lancet have retracted its declaration that there is no way COVID came from the lab, and at least admit today it is just as likely that it did, just as likely that it didn't. Given the amount of evidence to show a full-scale cover-up by the Chinese, starting in September 2019 onward, I have no doubt that it did leak from the lab. But okay, let's say we don't know. That's just conjecture on my part. Let's say there's only a 50% chance. 50% is pretty damn high for a virus that killed millions of people. And worse, a virus created with research possibly funded by the United States. If the risk is that high, then maybe we just shouldn't do that research at all anymore. That's the problem with what has occurred. After everything, after the exposure of Daszak as a liar and a Chinese stooge, as himself active in the cover-up campaign to save his own ass and Fauci, Fauci still on his way out gives him a US government grant to research bat coronaviruses in Southeast Asia. Have we learned nothing, people? Studying these viruses and engineering them may have started this whole damn thing. You're gonna fund the same guy who literally funded the Wuhan lab? I feel like I'm taking crazy pills watching this all unfold. And also the lack of media reaction. At the very least, it has to be a story that Fauci rewards a longtime controversial ally a grant on the way out. But nothing. The lack of media inquiry on this shows how complicit these people are in perhaps one of the greatest cover-ups in American history. And one which way they will look back on will not be kind to principal figures that I've mentioned here today. I only pray the same lab leak doesn't happen again. But since literally the exact same players are involved, why should we be so optimistic? I guess we'll wear a mask. That should do the trick. I mean, Krystal, Peter Daszak, look,
I have
again,
no words.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.